Hello, everyone. We are coming to you from a different location for this event. Thank you for joining us, friends. This is the second to last of the Lines of Flight events. And I just want to start by acknowledging the Center for Experimental Practices is based in Huddersfield in Northern England. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that modern England owes its existence to ongoing extractive and neo-colonial relations around the world. The rights of the peoples colonized by this country to live and work freely here and to participate in the determination of its future remain unceded. Center for Experimental Practices is a small and precarious new research center at University of Huddersfield. I think everybody who's on this chat currently probably already knows this center, but in any case, I will just pop over to the chat and put the link in case somebody joins. That being done, I'll mention that we have some videos from previous seminars that have been posted online. We have Lines of Flight from last year and from 2021. We have the Whiteness and Sound Studies videos, and then this video series of Lines of Flight New Laboratories. We're currently recording them, and we will be posting them once the series is done. So as I said, this is the second to last, and thank you to Kate and also Colin Frank, who's not here, but for all the logistics and organizing around these events. If you have questions, you can pop them in the chat. This is, you can see it's a different place, and the technology is slightly different setup, so if you suddenly can't hear us or can't see us or anything is going on that's strange, try to let us know. It's possible that we won't be able to hear or see you. That's the kind of situation we're in, but we'll do our best. Why are we here in this amazing sound recording DJ studio basement artistic?
The irony of that is
that's right. We're in like the best possible situation to not be able to hear you. I'm not going to introduce the place. The place is deep in my heart, but I'm going to introduce Kate Holden, Program Manager of CXP, who will introduce the place and our guests.
Hi. We are here in our penultimate Lines of Flight. It's one of my favorite words. Our second to last of the series, and I couldn't be happier to be here in the Bidston Observatory Artistic Research Center, which is located here on the Wirral in England, which, fun fact, the word whirl has the same root as the word weird. So we're in the right place for the weird and wild research here on the Wirral. So I would love to introduce our guests, Evans and Fee, who are part of the team here at BOARC and who have been involved deeply in its inception and evolution of the space. And they can tell us a little bit more about what exactly it is. How is an observatory and artistic research center? What does all of this mean? So love to give it over to you two, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So we've got some slides as well, just to give you a flavor of the space, because it doesn't really make sense if we're just, talking about what we do without understanding that what we do is deeply linked to a space, to a particular site, to the energies of that site, to the location, even how it's situated close. We're on the Wirral, but we're very close to Liverpool. The heritage of this actual building, which kind of brings particular people to it, but also as an observatory, it's still very much an instrument. It has basement spaces. It has, we'll show some slides in a moment, so you kind of get a flavor of what the actual project is doing, and can you see? But yeah, we'll give you a little framework for.
Wait, I might have to turn off this spotlight.
Yes.
What we actually do, we call ourselves an artistic research center, and we've been here for 7 years, but there was a big refurbishment project. No.
You're sharing your entire screen, but it's not showing that part.
I forgot to say things.
Yeah, sorry, back to Kate.
Yeah. Sorry, I need to mention, just while we're talking about place and site, that the University of Huddersfield and the observatory are in relation to one another and figuring out what that dialoguing might mean. So in the context of labs tonight, we're going to be touching on some of that, and it's become a really special place to some of us in the community at Huddersfield. And yeah, keeping that dialogue in whatever way it evolves forward feels really, I think, key to this. So institution or no institution.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and all the more reason for these dialogues, the more under threat. I think we'll come to this as well anyway, but the more under threat, like the humanities are, the more under threat, like, yeah, critical spaces are, the more need for keeping these anchors open. Sorry, guys.
We'll work on the, here, you hold this. We'll work on the slides and you,
Okay, well, I can speak a little bit about the model for the project, and in doing so, I'm like very mindful to credit the like genesis of the project as well. We are based on an existing project that's been running probably for about 15 years now, called PAF, or the Performing Arts Forum. It's 2 hours out of Paris, and it was initially set up by someone called Jan Ritzma, and is now run collectively and owned collectively, but was somewhere that was a big influence on those of us that set up the space, and the desire was to try and bring that model to the UK, and a lot of the principles of kind of like autonomy, in terms of like how it was looking at its funding structures and ways of working, ways of organizing there. So we're in lineage of that project, and it always feels, yeah, like very important to mention that. We're still in very close working relationship with that, and Massier as well. There's kind of a network of what we might call like lab spaces that are running with this similar pay to stay model, which I'll start to elaborate on now. So BOARC, here we go. BOARC covers, like, we own the building as an organization. The money was like appropriated from, again, to credit this, like feudal money, exploitation, things like that, gave us some funds that we wish to reappropriate. So we bought a building in which we hoped radical work could take place and kind of counter some of the histories and issues with where that money had come from. So a land sale is essentially how we procured this building. And we bring that, we're very transparent about that. We have enough money to buy the building and to refurbish it. And now it needs to kind of cover its own costs. And the way we do that is by offering like a study space without application. We have accountability practices in place that are critical to how the site runs, but people aren't expected to produce any outcomes from being here, even disclose the work that they get up to while they're here. People can stay for a period of 2 nights up to a month. And this attracts a wide range of different like disciplines and different methods of work. Lots of our users might be in the charity sector, in academia, in art practice, cultural practice. We also have, sorry, we're really having one here, aren't we? The gremlins are in. We can also make this available later. So yeah, we have a range of different users. People come in and out whenever they want. So it's not like a typical arts residency or retreat where there's an intake period, you're introduced to lots of people, and then there's an outtake period where you might produce or show your work or something like that. People drop in and out whenever they need to. And for us, this brings lots of like interesting crossovers and different uses of the building. We're close to a city, which also means we have people that just drop in to use the site for a day and then move out, crossing over with people that might have traveled from I don't know, Europe, the US even, to kind of like come and use the space for like a longer period of time and knuckle down to some work there. So there's lots of different temporalities in that way, tripping over itself. Because of the lack of application procedure as well, we'll have people that are very well established in their careers, meeting people that are self-taught artists or can't sit in typical educational contexts, maybe because of various mental health challenges or financial, restrictions that have disempowered them from being able to participate in typical lines of education or even typical artistic frameworks. So that's some of what this model supports. For that, we charge a nightly rate, which again is something that we hope to find ways around for particular communities. But we charge a nightly rate on a sliding scale that's self-declared between £20 and £40 a night. And for that, people come, they get a bed, but they also get to use the facilities here. So we have workshop space, we have movement rooms, we have lots of architectural features because it's 158-year-old observatory. So there are we have heritage domes, we have sub basements, we have things that maybe when we speak about STRAP a little bit, offer particular materialities to be working with and against and investigating. And there's no particular, well, we strongly advise or try and steer people away from a kind of hire model. So negotiation of the space is done by people as and when we're using it. We have a tiny team. So there's normally only 1 or 2 people on at a time, and this is what enables us to keep our rate as low as it is. And we say that they are kind of here for the building, and the building is here for the people coming through. So we're mindful of not becoming a kind of service site, but doing what we can to enable people to determine their own methods of work. A lot of what goes on here we don't even know about. We hear kind of positive feedback a year later. Someone's like, oh yeah, this project, oh, I should have told you about that started at Bidston. There will be these lines that come through. All of a sudden you'll notice that 2 people that crossed over here are working on collaborations or something like that, when they didn't know each other before they came in. But again, BOARC runs this model of non-capture, which has been very important from us from the beginning. You'll notice on the website there's very few photos of people and things like that unless they've kind of volunteered them. So that's the basic operation of the site. As I mentioned, we're very close to Liverpool, and there's a different meeting these different needs of different communities is something as well that the project is constantly renegotiating and figuring out. Our intention is to try and find, at the moment we set up a year before COVID, so it's been obviously intensely challenging for us. But we're kind of in this phase now where we're looking to establish different structures whereby the users of the site can start to take over its running. And this is for many different reasons. Partly as the people that engineered it, we don't believe that, or designed the initial framework, we don't believe we're the ones that should be filling it. It was always our intention to give a platform to others for this experiment to move in different ways. And yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Keep going.
So finding ways in which the resource can be, the resources that we do have, which sadly aren't financial, but are space-based, are facility-based, can be directed via, those that are using the site, those that need the site as well, those that can activate it in different ways. So this is kind of where we're at the moment. We're in a period of what we're calling transition. I don't know how long that will take. Ironic for an observatory that was based on time is Bidston time is its own thing. And this is quite a kind of like vital learning, I think, from the project. That things unfurl as and when they will. Things that become urgent. There's a kind of always an interpersonal nature to this because the site is intimate. And there's always a kind of like responsive nature to this because it's coming through interactions with stayers. So yeah, we're in this period of trying to find out how we might restructure to make the project more sustainable. That's covering, I guess, a lot of the kind of like basic model. I've not really touched on the building, and I know in the slideshow we had a lot of stuff put to one side in terms of the history of the building, which acts as a platform for a lot of different types of discourse, or like it's quite a fruitful backdrop to think from. Where in Merseyside, like the building and this asset is like afforded by like the colonial slave trading routes, and that like perpetual project within Liverpool afterwards. The observatory itself was designed and developed to assist in chronometer or testing of timepieces on ship's clocks. And has some very particular like kind of properties for that. It's been involved in many different legacies since then, namely tidal prediction being one of the most like prominent. There are lots of tangential lines through techno-feminism and things that come out of that too, because of the role of like computation, which was developed here, which was predominantly done by women. Many of which are like we've spent time with actually, and are kind of like still involved in some of the heritage work that takes place here. So there's many different cuts in, and maybe we can talk about HEX a little bit, because the Heritage Education Centre is like one of the interfaces that we kind of use as a like research practice or collective research practice, and has kind of emerged from our attempts over the last 5 years to be introducing the building in different ways, to be bringing different conversations to people that might be coming to engage in a historical landmark for one thing, but be open to a wider set of questions about what that implies, what those histories might mean and might entail, and the ways we try and bring people into those conversations are quite multiple. So we have standard heritage tours again, but there's a lot of discussion about whether that's the environment and ecofeminism, or there's opportunities there, let's say, to present certain ideas to publics that are invested in this site, and because of its location, into how BOARC is running and what this concept of artistic research is, full stop. So lots of people come here understanding that it's been a center for tidal research, understanding that it's very like famous for the D-Day landings, for example, having been planned here. The tidal prediction that was done here during the war is like, a crazy feat. We've spent a lot of time in the archives and things like that. But that's something that locally it's known for, and is a source of kind of like quite local pride. But like widening the conversations that we might have around that, like through both this what we're calling HEX, which stands for the Heritage Education Centre space, which hopes to bring people into contact with a different way of thinking of museology and archive. So much of that, we have like instruments on site. We're working with some of the former scientists that were running the National Oceanographic Centre, essentially, which is the third biggest like oceanographic centre in the world. Like Judith was running pole for that. And yeah, bringing in ways that these different discourses can mix and co-inform each other. We've done that through programming, but we're also doing that through this very physical space. So yeah, and as well towards like the materiality of the building speaks a lot to these histories. I mean, where we're sitting in now, you can't quite see it. We're in a rounded room. This is the recording studio. It's one layer below ground, and was the site of one of the first IBMs in the UK. So it's got like this huge like mechanical grill. It's got all of this sort of soundproofing. So wherever you kind of like stumble in the building, there's stuff that kind of exposes some of its past, and the research that was going on here. And again, it's something that we use now under this notion of instrumentalization and like thinking through strap, which maybe we'll come to as well, is a bit of a case study for something we're doing. Do you want to speak, Evan? I'm aware I'm like...
No, I've fallen into the tech role. Failing.
Is it possible, Evan, in your role as a steward, I wonder if we could hear from you, because it sounds like there's this fruitful transition period happening where it sounds like BOARC is moving from kind of people led to people run, right? Or so I'm curious if you can talk about what you do as a steward, how you relate to the building, things that feel, what's it like to be in a space collaborating with others where there's so much autonomy in this kind of really rich site. I don't, whatever calls to you to speak to based on that would, I think, be lovely to hear as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been here as a steward since January. But I was initially here as a live-in steward in 2022, I'm going to say.
Yeah.
So we have basically a small amount of stewards on site who are here each day. And then we have someone who's here for a period of 3 months, who's like a live-in steward who's responsible for the building overnight, basically. And the stewards sort of, I mean, it's in the term, but steward the space, and it's a sort of, I think for me, I'm trying to like figure out the way to be like present enough, but also like not an authority in the space, but to like support people to do what they need to do, but also like not be a barrier to that. So yeah, but the day-to-day is really like emails, laundry, generally chatting with stairs, doing an orientation, so like giving them a sense of like the values and the sort of like expectations in the space, but I suppose also trying to like model that to a certain extent. Because I think for a lot of people it's maybe, I mean, you get a lot of people coming through who are very familiar with this kind of way of operating, and then some who really haven't had this experience. So it's trying to like sense what people might need or how much knowledge they need, or so trying to be useful but not overbearing, basically. I guess it's like making stuff possible for people. But yeah, and then behind the scenes there is, of course, well, like as you can see, we have a lot of like materials, and we have this sort of like way of sharing things in a network, but it's sort of like crashed in this instance. But that's also sort of something that's like not, like, it's not a problem, right? We just figure it out. Yeah, I think is there anything else I can Any other questions
No,
in terms of the stewarding?
I think that's a great highlight, especially for potential viewers who might want to become potential stayers or tell their friends about it and what it's like. So, yeah, it sounds like you want to make things possible for people, which I think is really wonderful, and being intuitive and sensitive to their needs and the needs of the space at the same time. I think that's a really key role, and like a really kind of empowered role in a place like this. I think it's a wonderful role to sit in. I'm curious if maybe for folks who don't know or have never been in kind of this communal model, right, or people who might not know PAF or Masia, like, and I've been a stayer here, and I'm on a residency here. So maybe if you want to speak to like the communal ethos of the place, or, I know you touched on some of this earlier for you, but maybe like, what's it like if you come, there will be all kinds of people, and you might not meet the same person twice, or someone might just be a day user. But what is kind of the spirit of community, or for lack of a better term, the vibe of if you were to come? Like what might that be like? How does that autonomy manifest in use of the building and creative practice in the general, atmosphere of the building and its liveness as an entity?
Mm. I think, well, there's a lot to say. I think one thing I experience is maybe some hesitation around like how to say, like, that this is the building and you can really use it, and it's like you can access everything and you can do what you want. It's like you're not in someone's home, you're not in a sort of like site where you need to ask permission for everything. So I think there's a little bit of hesitancy around that often, and I think maybe that is one thing that I would sort of, I mean, it also speaks to like, the broader kind of political structures of things, that like how we relate to property, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, quite particular. So and then, I mean, we can only like sort of like put the sort of like energy there, or like the possibilities there, and then it's like actually quite determined by who's in the space at any one time, right? And how they interact and what that dynamic is. So we can't control it either, right? But we can like sort of set up things that make it possible if there are any issues or not, which are very few ultimately.
Yeah, we have quite a robust like accountability practice and things like that in play, but it so seldom gets used.
Yeah,
people like, I think as soon as like something, because the space is based on trust, that everyone holds that together, and there's an understanding for that. This is also why, we have a 2-night minimum, so it takes that long to set into the space and understand that you're like this, that you're in some form of community, whatever that might be. And people don't necessarily always get it the first time. It's kind of interesting. People like kind of come back. The big thing we've had some issue with, like people be like, I'd love to do this in this space. And I'm like, well, do it. That's what the space is there for. And in some ways that seems a little bit, I think there is a UK like framework within that, like with how our like funding structures are presented, like, as I say, how residency, like these notions of judgment, like even in the last 10 years of like what artistic practice has to contribute to the like kind of social, and like these like frameworks of experimentation and like failing and all of that stuff, like have kind of been eked out or restricted in certain ways, that we have people that have come here for the first time, and it's like this, by the second time they come back, they kind of, it's like, oh really, I don't have to do anything. If I sleep for a week, it's okay. Or but it's not something that's common in the UK, like certainly in comparison as well to my experiences of being at PAF, where like there is a different kind of taking of spaces. Like I think activist practice, the squat scene in the UK was like, radically crushed. Like obviously there's still interesting things happening, but we really have to keep re-emphasizing that like try us, you know.
Mm.
Yeah, try us, see. Like what like, oh, you want to do that? Then we try to make possible. We've had to model the space quite a lot, and programming and things also, like as a point of entry for people, but like what might happen here too.
That might be a good moment to pivot into talking about Strap.
Yeah.
As a case study of entry points for people, because it sounds uniquely compared to the other labs that we've spoken to this series. You're the only one with a residential component, but it's beyond a residential component, right? It's a component of community practice is how I'm kind of hearing it being, if I were to summarize it right now in that way. Yeah. And that you might not get it the first time, you know, it's like playing an instrument, right? You might not get the guitar the first time you pick it up, but you might have to then go back. Okay, what's it like this time? How is it different? Who's here? Or what am I inspired by in the space? Or what part of the building is talking to me? Or like this. So I think that's a really wonderful aspect of the lab in this context, because many of our others have differed because there isn't this community-centric component with all beings and people and the landscape around it and where we are located and placed. So yeah, that's been really rich. So points of entry for people. STRAP is, mess up this acronym, which I do every time. So it's SSTRAPP.
The Sonic and Somatic Transdisciplinary Research and Practice Program.
Yes.
STRAP.
So it's on the screen. Okay, I can't see it.
There's just some images.
There's some images, right? So STRAP is.
Yeah, STRAP kind of came about with talking to someone who, again, had been doing the like live-in role here, and having conversations about the type of work that was happening in the space. And I was sort of saying that we know the building, because of it being observatory, has lots of very particular properties to it, like acoustic properties, for instance, because of the domes, because of the recording studio, because of sub-basement spaces. And there's been a lot of interest through people working with sonic, whether that's philosophically, practically, like through the making of music, recording of albums. There's been a lot of work that's taken place here from that, and somatic practice as well. And again, that's because some of us who have been at the site for a while or been involved with the project from the beginning, like lean to those practices. So things start congregating around that, but we didn't necessarily have a way of trying to hold that community together other than being like, oh, I should introduce you to, or, oh, you should try and come when so-and-so's here because they're doing this thing. So we'll be making these efforts to like help facilitate some of these conversations. But STRAP came out of this need of being like, well, there's all this great work and I wish they would meet them and I wish we could do this. And yeah, I want to like dance with you whilst you're doing this and whilst you're thinking this. And like, how can we start to, like, what containers can we make to like call people to arrange around? STRAP was also a kind of like particular intervention which goes back to the origins of wanting to set up the site as a para-academic space, and like in essence like design this curriculum that's really kind of like frenetic and moving and based on what people want to do. So Inigo Wilkins is, and May Devine, or Quieting is their like musical name, and they're kind of running the program, but it has lots more people kind of like affiliated and kind of like supporting it. There have been 4 workshops so far, and this summer we have like an open space to continue some of the stuff that's been coming out of that program. So much of it has been meeting ideas or like really like high level theory on around sonics, like whether that's noise, whether like each one has had like a kind of particular thematic and focus, and for this kind of piloting series, I guess we had these 3-week-long workshops. Those workshops would have like a discussion in the morning, or like a kind of lecture, very open format for that. There would be periods of kind of collective diagramming and taking apart some of those theories. There might be some activities that would happen, whether that's like field recording in the day or like movement practice or something like that. And then there would be like experimenting with like either physical equipment or practices together in the afternoon. And over the week, this would like emerge into performances around the building, or like different propositions, talks and things like that would have been put together by people that have only essentially just met each other, but have like an interest in what's a very, very wide set of concerns, like sonic and somatic. And these different like post-colonial philosophies, for example, noise, like theories of noise, many different kind of tendrils that come into that, ideas around synthesis that could then be physically modeled in the space and experimented and played with, but also in these open formats that makes it accessible to, differently accessible than maybe a fixed curriculum would be. So Strat runs also as a model where people like pay to kind of attend, but that is restricted like to the minimum that it can just be to be able to facilitate and cover the cost of the teaching. And then anything within that period that takes place. The summer jam will be 10 days where that research can kind of come, and is even less structured than the three workshops that existed on synthesis, on noise, and on co-motion or bodies in motion. So just to sort of set these bounds by which people might come together to experiment together, which seems like a very simple thing, right? It seems like that should be happening everywhere, and it is in these smaller degrees. But actually coming together with people that you totally don't know because a framework or a container has been called, with people of all different levels of kind of like experience, professionalization, like, as I say, interests in these two kind of ideas or modes or ways that we might study. I think it's actually quite rare, and for us, the big thing has been about accessibility, like making accessible to anyone that wants to participate in it.
I mean, I was part of the initiation weekend, so we had, I don't know, something like over 20 people for the kind of figuring out what might this Strat programming be back in September. And even the words sonic and somatic are huge, right? We probably spent a very good bit of time diagramming what those words might mean, having dialogues about them, working together in this space. But there is something, I think, very present in the ethos of the space and the building and the people holding it that it wasn't utopic. People did disagree. People were like, oh, I don't see that eye to eye with you, but okay, cool. Or, oh, I never thought about it before. It wasn't, there is something in the nature of the para-academic or the whole thing as a lab container where, and I think the autonomy of self-organization where, okay, I can bring that and you can bring that. And they might not exactly kind of converge or do this, but what happens when they both exist together? Right. And that I think is really wonderful. We are having another Strat session this coming weekend in just a few days. It is a queer voices theme. This one is a shorter session. So in terms of accessibility, we're noticing people might not be able to get away for a whole week. And that's really tricky. It's a tall order in a world where space and time are very limited. So we're trying out a weekend just to see what that's like for people. If that feels different, not better, worse, but like, oh, okay, does a weekend feel attainable or like a thing that makes sense to do. And the event description is being shown now, but we're exploring kind of non-normative uses of the voice, eco uses of the voice, pushing gender limits of the voice, the mythopoetic, the beyond, the what voices should and shouldn't do. But that came out of self-organized interest of people saying, oh, can you do a voice thing? And going, yeah, can I do that? Yes, I can give a weekend to do that. And I get that not everybody can do that, but it's also the, you know, group demands, or people wanted synths, and okay, great, we'll explore synths for a week, which, you know, Maeve did a fantastic job kind of figuring that out too. So I feel like there becomes like an ecology or a sense of responding to group need, meeting individual need, and then making it work for people in an economic way that makes sense, and in a resource way that makes sense beyond the economics. And I think, yeah.
I think also within that, like, this kind of sense of relationality that happens in all of this stuff, and as you say, some of these things, like there's been quite a lot of, because you don't have that institutional structure just to fall back on, and it's essentially like we're transparent that the project's shaping, things are moving, like, and as well, you can't just criticize it, because it's also for you to kind of like activate and do something about if you're like finding something that doesn't work. Of course, we have accountability structures and stuff, but a different thing happens in that. It really is co-learning, like in terms of those hierarchies, even when somebody is kind of like holding or hosting the space and like graciously like directing what happens within that time and that kind of like narrative arc that might be followed. There is so much stuff that comes from being in this domestic environment as well, and having this protracted time. You wake up together, like you've in theory got like 24 hours together, you drop out, of course you sleep, you come in, you come out, and lots of people, like, given how stressful it is out there at the moment, it's, I mean, I've been running a different program and a similar program and being like, yeah, like these kind of work groups where people are really meeting their own needs through the different spaces of the building as well at the same time as this co-study is, I think, a particular strength of, yeah, this way of working together. And as you say, that something can then develop as another like arch in that story. It's like these little moments of voice that have like been really calling for like a more in-depth, right, okay, we'll do that one together, and then we'll see what that does and like how that emerges in a later version of Strat, because people have some of this teaching or some of this resourcing or some of this opening. This is the other thing to remember, that this stuff does to us. You know, it does to us. So it's not just having like these conversational points or these kind of like academic knowings as we meet together again and again around this very like these themes that certain people have been part of and not for others, and but that as it does us, something develops alongside as well. I don't know if I'm making sense with that, but I'm thinking of this particularly in terms of the Queer Voicing Project, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's designed so that people can evolve it in their own way, right? And or bring their own strands and allow it to happen and move through and with, rather than like, oh, I know, you know, how do I say this? Yeah, I think rather than from a place of knowledge holding and then be like, now I have transmitted this to you. That's it. It's not so clean, I think, in a good way, right? Where it allows for loose ends or continuations or the ellipses of, real embodied knowledge change as well, and embodied sense and felt sense and shifts in those ways too.
We talk a lot about the palliative, and like Straps really brought that up again, because we're working with some of these, like when you're working with a body practice, it's actually physically doing something, let's say, and then you're touching on theories that are decolonizing you somehow, and like all of the like prickles and like moments of realization and things that come through that, like needing this kind of expanded space to be able to work with that. So I mean, I know with Strap, like there's a week after of like this kind of co-processing that takes place between the people that have been holding that space as well, to figure out how that might happen again next. But yeah, I think that's probably something that doesn't get there's a lot of this at BOARC, like the defrag after something has come and met, or like something has happened, like these learning from the kind of like resonances or energetics that have been disturbed or shaken up. I don't mean disturbed in like naturally like a bad sense, but shaken up through those processes, like. And it's not necessarily for the want of course there are things in certain like which we look to like make the space continually more accessible, but it's a very particular form of learning, like within the domestic space. Like, what is all this research that we're doing about if it can't be lived in the relationship that you have in the building with other people as well? So there's these kind of two scales taking place there, if that makes sense.
I think that's a great way of articulating it. Yes, absolutely. That they feed each other, and how are we for time? Just because I can't see.
Oh, it's almost 7, so I mean it's a good time to sort of open up this conversation, maybe pick up some of the things we were talking about yesterday, before we go to see. I don't know if anyone who wants to add anything at this time, just feel free to put comments or questions in the chat. We will kind of also ask later if anybody wants to jump in, but I'd like to say something about the building. I mean, I think I don't know if it's been like almost a year or maybe less than that I've been coming. It hasn't been that long since I first came here. I think it was just last summer. But this place has become very, very meaningful to me, and it kind of hit me as soon as I entered. Like I came into this building, I was like, "What is this building? How is this possible? What is going on here?" And someone who was being the living steward at that time gave me this tour of this building, and there was these kind of two aspects, but I think they map onto what you were just talking about, two different scales, which is also different temporalities, which is like, I'm being given this tour of this building, and every part of the building is like, first of all, it has like incredible kind of architectural and like historical depth and mystery also, like the idea that, so if you look at the photos, what's very clear is there's these domes, these two domes. So it's like you go and these domes, there's these wooden domes which are like observatory domes, but they're not functioning as observatory domes at this moment, but there's something else. And the whole building is like that, like the hallways, the rooms, the way in which it's residential. There are some single rooms and double rooms, and then there's like a like a room with a whole bunch of beds. And then there's this amazing communal kitchen, which to me, a big communal kitchen is always a really profound thing for me. I've experienced that in certain other places that have a big communal kitchen. It's like the foundation of community. But then like also there's like another kitchen. There's like a small kitchen in the back. And then the same thing, then you're like, okay, that must be the building. Then you go down and there's a whole basement. In the basement, there's a recording studio. There's like a DJ setup. There's like other rooms that have these workshop things going on. I mean, I'm just describing it again because I think, as someone who has come into it relatively, I have this kind of impression of it. And then it's like keeps going on because you go through the basement and then there's another basement. There's a sub basement. So the building is it's kind of epic. Like just to go through the building is epic in terms of the differences, the powerful like architectural affective differences of the kinds of spaces from the dome. I mean, from the domes to the sub basement is also a huge change in elevation. But while I'm being guided through this, it's like you expect that if you go to like where a hospital or like a university, you're like, okay, huge institution, epic spaces. Like, yes, of course there's a boardroom, but also a dance studio, but also a cafeteria, like that kind of, but in this space, it's like you're being guided through it, and like there's no that kind of institutional domination and holding that tightly holds those kinds of spaces together, where it's like, okay, let's think about the university, because I mean, this whole idea of the para-academic and the relationship of BOARC to universities and all, other kinds of spaces too, but I think it's so incarnated here because of the physical site. Where, like, at a university, yeah, you have the boardroom and the dance studio and the cafeteria, but they're held all in this dominating matrix from the top down that ensures that, like, the dance studio can't get too weird from the perspective of the boardroom. And the same with the cafeteria, can't get too communal. Like, it's got to be all locked down in a certain way in these kind of modern functional institutions. But what we have here is like a relic of a modern functional institution that is being stewarded in this completely different way, where it's being held lightly, it's being held with a completely different ethos of community, of exploration, of this. I mean, it's called artistic research, but like not all artistic research has that ethos. I mean, it's a very particular, extremely open, generous, somatic approach to, and critical approach to artistic research. So for me, BOARC is like really essential in this series of questions of new laboratories, because all of us are in some way, and I hadn't thought about this before, but it's very concrete. Like all of the quote unquote new laboratories, like the question is kind of like, laboratory comes from science, right? So like, what happens when the critical arts and humanities appropriate that concept? But here it's so physical, because it's like, this really is an old scientific observatory, and it really is holding these incredibly important questions of like, what can we do with it? What does it need? What does it want? What can people make of it? And they're I don't know that they're fully answered, but they're held open in a way that I think is so important, because I think it's so easy to, as you mentioned, Fia, in the very beginning, when you said like we don't want to become a kind of like a venue or a service, like there's and this is again temporality, where you really feel the temporality, like the temporality of capitalism and presentism is like, who cares about the history? Like that used to be an observatory. I don't care. So like, immediately, of course, you can make it financially sustainable, or even you can make money if you just do this, just like chop up the building, cut the parts apart, make each part do whatever it can function, then rent the parts, and again chop up the rental. So like, you're renting that room and you're renting that room and you're renting, everything gets kind of, and again, it's dominated from the top. And it's like, you could do that, but then you would kill everything. But that's usually what happens to older buildings, like older kind of institutional forms, is they just get re-dominated and remapped in this way that is very privatizing and individualizing. And this question is being held up here, and this is why when I was given this tour at the beginning, I was like, stunned, like I couldn't believe it. And each new room I could believe less, because I was like, how is it possible that such a epic building, is being held so rigorously against that kind of recapture, that kind of dominating remapping of like, reuse the building, throw out these parts, remake. I was like, who is doing this? Who is holding this space and refusing to sell it? What's the word for when like a company buys another company and you strip it for parts? You kind of like, tech companies do that. You buy a tech company and you're like, we bought it, so we can do whatever we want. You chop it, and so someone is holding this building and like not chopping it up for parts and not selling it and not privatizing it. I was stunned. So I fell deeply in love, and then I've been coming here, and like, it's very much part of this question about labs, but it's really unique. I'm giving like a little my paean, or what's the word, my praise of BOARC. It's like, this way in which it's because of the site, and not, I mean, because of the way in which the site is held and the ethos and the relationship, is like asking those questions about the future of those pasts, which are, they are also the colonial pasts, like that modernist institution, that modernist scientism is colonialism, as you very clearly indicated at the beginning. So the legacy of that, it's like, the desire to, it really makes you think about the way that those buildings are treated, where it's like, okay, get rid of the past, remap it. Now we have nothing to do with that past. So like on the one hand, it's like you cut out the past and you act as if everything is starting fresh and there's no legacy from all that violence. But actually, the techniques that you're using to produce the new institution are the exact same ones. So you're not even making any difference at all. You're just kind of rebooting the same thing. Whereas what I experience here is like these multiple temporalities, where it's like the past is still here. We still feel the presence of all the scientific observatory. There's a whole project. The HEX project is like towards the past, towards this question of lineage and legacy, and like, what do we do with the heritage of it? It's all still there. But then at the same time, all of these other activities are there, and these questions about community are there, and this very contemporary question of like, what is artistic research is there, and it's all just kind of there in this way that's very open but very, very rigorous, because it refuses to perform this thing that, in some way almost all the other hybrid laboratories or whatever that I can think of are all like, we're occupying these little places in the university, but in that way we're also very, very constrained by that occupation of the university space. And the very concrete examples that have already been mentioned are like, and I wrote about this in an essay years ago in 2018, that like, you're very limited in what you can do with time in the university. Like, the university has its timetable. You can't just be like, I'm going to work with some students overnight. That you're not allowed to do that. You can't go to sleep and wake up together. You're blocked from all of these kind of other rhythms. You can't be like, we're going to do this project, it'll be about the seasons. There's just the seasons are blocked. Like, dusk and dawn, the meaningful of that is blocked. All these time things are just blocked by the university with its dominating mapping of time. And because of this space, because it is residential, because it inherits all this, because of the way it's being held, the questions are so profound, and like, no wonder they don't have clear answers. Like, it's a project of decades, maybe multiple lifetimes, to figure out, like, because this is what I want to say. I will stop, I promise. The potential is here for the genuinely different kind of space, institution, organization that we so desperately need. That other university, or that other mode of study, or that other mode of sacredness that is, that we so desperately need, where we can come together, and it's not just individualizing, and it's not rejecting all sociality. That other sociality, that's what I'm trying to say. The potential is here because it's being held. The forces that would like to strip it for parts are being held at bay somehow, magically. And so there is that possibility of a truly other kind of sociality emerging and appearing.
I just want to cut in on one thing from that, like, in terms of, because I feel this is Bidston, this is the energy of this building, but this is the energy of the hill. This building is cut from the sandstone rock. Like, the sub-basement that they were doing, like earth tide research, like, there's always been, like, this building, like, it's about a humility and in syncing with the environmental, like, conditions that are around it. This building exists because of the nature it was there to study, but that nature comes first somehow. When we were looking for a building or whatever, we were just like, well, this is one, we can buy it, but we are never going to own it, because it's in a completely, like, its own kind of realm. And you meet that, like, when you're talking to the scientists that used to work here, like, who are wonderful people, mega grounded, because they've just been looking out in awe at this, like, wider interconnectivity, like this sacredness, like understanding the humility of what it is to work with material rather than against it in this way. I was also thinking of something, because like when we were looking for the building to do this project, like we looked all over the place, and then this one like called, partly because of that thing of being like, right, as I say, everyone is going to feel that they have ownership of this somehow, or that they might have a right to because of this colonial heritage too. So that already starts to do something interesting. And at a time when I was at Queen Mary, when it was like supposedly one of the only solvent universities, and I was walking around and there were all the kids in the corridors because they couldn't even use, they were hiring the classrooms to like each department. Like you couldn't go in at the weekend and even work because you could sit outside your office. But like every time someone was in that room, it cost that department some money. So this kind of like idea of like having a building that's unlocked, you know, you can get in all of the codes down here. There's one room, like our old flat, that's locked also because you can't go in there because you can't use it fire safety wise. Like everything else, you can flow between these spaces and stuff, but like really seeing like how much dancing and weird stuff was happening in that academic environment, because you just couldn't go into that room, like how much time was wasted. So yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a like sidebar, but I really think this notion of scale, when we focus on the physical materiality of the building, that is one thing, but when we focus on this place on a sand spit that was formed like when winds were blowing off the continent and it stacked up and then it got so hot it turned the sandstone into glass, and now there's a thing that can pick up vibration in Japan and earthquakes across the world, and like this is kind of entrenched in its history and still evident here. You've got to be kind of small with that stuff as well, you know, like there's a humility that with that, and that blending with the domestic is as well a kind of right to return to the body in some way. I don't know, these are my kind of research interests, but I wonder what that does.
Yeah, I think it does lead nicely into the conversation that we started to have yesterday, which is underlying the new Laboratories series and all of Center for Experimental Practices, this idea that there are these kind of marginal or liminal spaces, para-academic spaces, para-artistic spaces maybe, and this question about how to connect them more, because they often feel marginal in some way to their local context or their national context, and you know, some of them are better funded than others, but they all have a certain precarity, I think. I mean, even the better funded ones tend to be in a situation that's like, you know, you're better funded for this year, but not necessarily for next year. And so I feel this deep need for a kind of connectivity and horizontal allegiance and alliance and solidarity. But it's so challenging because everyone is in their different situations and circumstances. And, you know, what we've been saying about the building is like, it's so emplaced, and all labs and projects are emplaced, but like, this is so emplaced, it's so powerfully emplaced that, you know, and you mentioned at the beginning, PAF and Masia as these other places that there's a relation, and that seems really important. Like that's already an ecology, a triangle, you know. But I think, yeah, you know, there's another big open question is, which it's very related, right? Because actually you can't really get anywhere with the question of what needs to happen in this kind of place without asking how it's related to other places, you know. And I think what I'm talking about is not its relationship to necessarily a university that's nearby, but I'm talking about its relationship to a place that has a similar ethos, that has maybe a different history, but also is at least aware of its history, that is maybe quite far away, maybe in another part of the world. And like, how do those relations get built? You know, because I think I love the way you talk about the agency of the building and the power of the materiality of the building and what the building is doing. And I'm wondering, like, it's an observatory, so in a way it's like, you know, it's in a kind of witnessing role, like it's stepped back, it's like looking at the world, but that is a relationality. But like, how does it reach out? I mean, you mentioned like it can observe, you know, the instruments can observe like geographical tremors on the other side of the planet, so like that's a reaching out. You know, it makes me wonder if there's a space, a site that is over there, that is, you know, linked in some way through tidal patterns or through seismic patterns. But like, how does this kind of site, in all its layers, from the building, the observatory history, the hex, strap, other activities, like, what are the potentials for its interconnectivity, to enable what I keep calling a planetary frame, like, you know, to be able to not be less emplaced, but just to be able to properly and honestly articulate its emplacement in the world that we live in, with these, you know, with modernity and post-modernity and colonialism and ecological crisis. Like, how do we articulate emplacement? You know, to articulate emplacement, there has to be relationality.
I think I have 2 points. I wonder, yeah, well, really quickly, I think what we gleaned recently is really important knowledge about the kinds of places and labs that are worthy of connection. And so we hosted a queer research symposium through the University of Huddersfield here 2 weeks ago. And it was fabulous and amazing because of what this building does and its perspective and what it's able to not just observe and hold. I mean, candidly, and I don't mean this in a woo-woo way, I mean this in a very, like, real way, I think the building does much more than witness. That's my take. But I think from a kind of ecosomatic framework, I think there's aliveness and a presence to the building that does more than just get observational, or is not, you know, just about taking measurements. There's really something where, I mean, it's so rich and expansive, and that, yeah, energetically, there's a lot here, and that's the best way I can put it into tangible wording. But I think what we learned was that, or what I have learned, I don't know about we, but what I have learned from that process is, I don't think it's a matter of academia or Huddersfield specifically, or whoever institution. I almost am comfortable saying that I think that the relationality is better suited to other organizations doing the same thing, places like PATH and places like Masia, because the ethics are just too radically different. Like, Glitter Party could never happen again under the university's watch, right? That's a thing that we know. The institution can't hold it, but this can hold more than the institution, right? And it's like that dichotomy, I think, is really key, because it's like, could there be an ongoing partnership? And it's like, well, no, because the ethics are totally different. Do you know what I mean? The core values don't align. And yeah. I think because of that problematizes, or it truncates the kinds of connections that can be formed with other, like, capital I institutions, rather than places that are operating, I think, with better and different ethics. But, you know, yes. The other thing is, Ben, I'm curious if you can explain a little bit about this term "emplaced" that you keep using, only because I think maybe folks are more familiar with the term placemaking or place-based, but what might emplacement be? That is a newish word to some folks out there. I haven't heard it much, so I'm curious if you're able to articulate that a little bit, just because I think it's an interesting term, and yeah, I'd like to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I have a little flag up in my head that says, like, whatever I say here, I may not be offering the complete citations. There's probably things I'm forgetting because I'm trying to think, like, where is that exactly coming from? I mean, I think one place it's coming from is like, using the word embodiment for a long time and starting projects, organizing projects like Journal of Embodied Research around that notion, or what a body can do, like body, body, body. And there's a dear friend and anthropologist and theater practitioner, Caroline Gatt, who was one of the first people who came into my research and was like, body, I got to use the word body. What's that doing? I'm not sure about body. Do we need to have the body in that way? There's a later talk that I'm thinking of where Fred Moten says, "Fuck a body, don't have one, don't need one." So there's this kind of questioning of like, and I'm still like, I'm not giving up on the body. I'm still very thinking about the body, but I think that in my recent thinking and reading particularly, what I'm really kind of thinking is that a lot of what I mean by the body is diasporic. And so in that way, it's also different, because another thing is that I've come into encounter with like cognitive science and its kind of idea of like cognition is embodied. And that's not really what I mean by embodiment. And at the symposium, we had a symposium in October where there was a conversation about embodiment and what's the body doing, the body versus the flesh, from the work of Hortense Spillers. So this kind of questioning of the body, but my feeling after that was really like, I hear you on that, but actually I think what I was meaning by the body was closer to the flesh, actually, and is not what is meant by the body. But it makes me realize, like, the limitations of the body is, there's this, because it's not just the medical body, it is the, like, cognition is embodied as this very universalizing kind of thing. So I guess in my recent thinking, I've been thinking about the diasporicness of the body that I've been thinking about, and I've been following people like Tiffany Letabo King and trying to place that in relation to Indigenous thought and Indigenous studies. Tiffany Letabo King wrote a book that's very impactful to me called The Black Shoals, which is about Black and Native, not just intersections, but like overlappings and interminglings and connectivities and similarities and differences and samenesses in North America. So that book is very much about diaspora and positionalities that are neither settler nor indigenous. And that has really changed my way of thinking about the body, that I'm always like, okay, the body, but it like that, the body is not ground. The body is like, ground is ground, emplacement is ground. The body is a kind of ground because the body comes out of the earth, but the body is like a floating piece of earth. It's like if I use like language of sedimentation, like the body is like a little piece of earth that floats up out of the earth, like a little particle. And so it can move. And so when I say diasporic, like bodies move across places. That's history, like in different ways, in different relations. So bodies move. So bodies are kind of grounding, but they're grounding in a different temporality than the grounding of the earth. So that's why I'm always now, whenever I say embodiment, I'm like, and emplacement. Embodiment and emplacement. Because we always, I think we have to think embodiment in relation to emplacement. The people, like being very concrete, like people who come through here are in relation to the building, but it's not the building. It's like the site, but the site is the place. I mean, as you were also evoking, like the layers of the geographic formation, like the bodies are the things that move fastest, actually. Well, the knowledge moves fastest, and then the bodies are kind of next, and then the building doesn't move that fast, but still the building is fast compared to the limestone, or it's very fast. It's only 150 years, compared to the sound. So there's all of these layers. That's what I mean by emplacement.
Oh, Ben. The knowledge moves fastest. The first thing that came into my brain was Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen's adage of the brain is the last to know, right? I think there's so much happening here on a deep level that cognition and that digestion and integration of everything you learn here, I don't think it's so immediate. Do you know what I mean? Like I think the knowledge moves fast, and like I don't know why I had like such a no way. I don't think that's possible, because I think knowledge is happening and circulating. But in terms of like integrating and like moving, like transmission, yeah, maybe. But I do think that the unique thing about the emplacement here is that you might start a thing or think you're doing one project, and then 6 months later you're like, oh wait, I'm having this residual thing where now this is really integrating into my system, and now this embodied experience I had with somebody in the dome, it's not just the memory of, but you're very much back and in there, not through just memory. But I can see this term emplacement, and I'm actually glad that you elaborated on it in relationship to embodiment in your way of thinking through that, because I would love to also know like where to find more on that, you know, in literature somewhere, because I'm like, this term is literally new to me, other than looking at a grant application. I've never seen it. So it's great. With that emplacement, so just to return to what you raised, Ben, and some of the things we've been talking about, without things becoming solely site specific, I mean, I'm using that term from theater in the way that like it can only happen here in this place. And like that might be true for a lot of what goes on here. I don't know, right? That's forever a question I'm willing to hold. But what is how might this horizontal network manifest if there's, you know, already kind of this triad of Masya and BOARC and PAF and people we don't even know about doing cool stuff? And how do those things intermingle and come together? What are the shared resources, or even shared data, or shared knowledges, or embodied experiences? All of that. What do we think that starts to look like? Or how does that grow and strengthen what seeds have been planted, or what seeds scatter even and go into the wind, and what else can form or take shape? So I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that, but
I mean, I'd be interested to hear some more about how you see the relations of BOARC, PAF, and Massey. I think that's a really good starting point, because we know that, as you said at the beginning, BOARC is inspired by PAF, but it's also very different. Different site, different country, as different cultural and national context, right? And Massey is newer, I think. But like, what are some of like? Is there a possibility of the three working? Do they work together? Is it desirable that they should work together, or is it better that they not work together and people just flow between them? Can they become unified in a way that doesn't, you know, harm their individuality? Like, you know, it's a small scale question that's like super important. Like, how do you see that relationality?
I mean, there are certain things that we would like to do that are like, when we're talking like with something like strap, like how we move that between these three places, and like what gets learned, and like different experiments within that, because we can learn from those experiments together. But and yeah, when we're here, we're bringing something to place, as I was sort of saying. Like, again, we're in a very like economically deprived area and things like that, so it, like, not everyone can travel, not everyone can put their body in different places. So there's like, on that very, very simple level, it's useful. And there's a wider network than just PAF and Masya as well. I mean, we have values and we have politics in common. And those are politics that, like, some of that was seeded and founded with the idea of PAF, but their practice, it's come through practice, it's come through awkward relations in seminars that then lead to new ways of practicing or arranging, like working groups or something like that. And so through that knowing, I mean, perhaps the people I go to when I'm wondering things as well, like the people I trust, because we've been through some of these similar experiences, but those experiences have had an effect of removing some of the restrictions in our ways of thinking through, like, co-experimentation. So like exposure to each other, and like even to Jan's original like form, which was to put trust in people, that people would look after a space, right? People would look after something, people would develop something, and that went a long way. But a lot of the things that we share and we know from are like through both like the research and the being in that research together, like whether that's being in talks and then seeing what it looks like when you run a talk differently, when you do something differently, when you like try these other practices alongside it, and it's like, oh right, we've learned this thing, let's suppose a whole other stuff. So there's something that's completely not transferable between the sites, but these values or these ideas and these there's shorthands of like like that things will find a way, and like that's because the scissors like finally found their place. Like there's these very slight knowledges and knowings that build up over time and become transmissible through these deep relationships. But there are things that are core and consistent among that then you think into a different site. Like, it's like, I remember speaking with Anne, it's like, right, BOARC here. I'm like, well, there's no point setting up another path. You don't need another path, right? So what might BOARC do in being like slightly more public, in being a more intimate site, in being a smaller site, in being in the conditions of the UK? Like, what different things come out of there? Does it work? Maybe it doesn't. We don't know at the moment. Things are tough, right? So like, but the core values or principles of kind of like non-judgmental like frameworks, trust, mutual trust, like these ideas of like path runs with the doer decides, like this care, don't leave traces, minding asymmetry, and making possible for each other. And those principles are also like encoded into here. Yeah, I might be drifting from what you're saying because I'm still kind of in the emplacement conversation a little bit as well. I'm wondering if it's not like the knowledge moves faster, but like how then I'm thinking of these field dynamics of knowledge, and the body moves and it tunes into this knowing, this intelligence that is already somehow there. And how that relates also to having these like three sites that are kind of like co-traveling somehow. And in different levels of this experiment, but intrinsically still caring because the principles are the same thing, moving out in different trajectories.
Could you, since we're still on emplacement a little bit, could you touch on Masia a little bit? Because Masia is in Estonia.
Yeah, so Masia is in Estonia. It's I've never been, though I have deep desires to go. It's in like quite rural, like bogland. It's an old school, so again, it's smaller in terms of path. Like I think it sleeps probably about 30 people. And its conditions are very different as well. Seppi, who's been looking after the space for a long time, amazing herbalist, like her practices, like her ecologies, that's like very ingrained in the space, which has like garden, like sits with these cycles, very like encoded in nature, queer space as well. And the work that's taking place there has a different time to it. I think Masia shuts over winter because it's impossible to keep it open because it's really cold there. The gardens are put to bed, so that's a big activity. There's these times that it like moves with a different form of time. So I think all three sites probably have a different relation, like temporal relations as well. So different forms of programming and practice are like possible there, but also the model of like PAF and how PAF has been like covering its costs. I think it took about 10 years like to fully come to that place. It's now owned by 50 owners, so like as well the site is kind of secure in and of itself. But Masia, like the economic conditions in Estonia are completely different, and so that's brought with it a different set of challenges. Traveling there are harder. It's not like near Paris is on this kind of like movement route through the rest of Europe. We even notice the distance of that being on the rock, like Pafax is a different node. So different sets of problems and challenges are coming up for Massia, and I think that's also just where it is in its age. But like how we can think of those together is something that we're looking at a lot. And people cycle between the spaces as well. People from Massia come here and like vice versa. But yeah, they all have different conditions from which to kind of like do these modes of experimenting. Or bog, everyone's just like, yeah, Massia, the bog. It's like just this beautiful, like, but a different speed to it. A different speed to it, but also different infrastructure. There's a lot of people thinking to Massia, but I know Seppi does a huge amount of work as a like single individual in that space as well, and there's more people gathering to it. But yeah, this is the big question with all these things: how to make the labor of holding these spaces as well sustainable. Because we were speaking yesterday quite a lot about finance, but it's also about these energies that go in and being able to sustain those, which is becoming harder and harder as we know.
With that, I wonder, continuing the emplacement on a different strand maybe. So sharing resources, having this, I mean, Ben and I have talked a lot about how to cartograph this kind of network. Like, what does that even look like? How they all know about each other? Who's on what radar? Because I think people cycle through, which is lovely, but then it's like, well, how do you get new folks, and how do you get a new space that does this kind of lab situation? So maybe if we could touch on some of the points from yesterday that I remember were kind of acute need in the field of the other labs. Like, what do they need? Like, what's the next, resource for them? What are the shared materials in terms of knowledge transmission or embodied knowledge transmission? I certainly don't just mean, collective essays or something, but whatever discipline it might be or whatever form it might take. Ben, in your case, is it video essay? Is it beyond somebody's oral history of I went, or their energetic shift of coming back, and then they impact the whole community because they've been there? So yeah, what might get transmitted, and then kind of what could this horizontal network look like? How might that be shaped? I think maybe those might be some areas to go down.
Yeah, maybe I'll recap in this context this thing that I was talking about yesterday, which is sort of just like a new idea. It's sort of just like a spitball. It's definitely not fully formed at all, but like this idea that if you had a big network of hybrid labs, and of course they'd have to have common ethos and common principles to a certain degree, but obviously they would also diverge in other ways.
I got
it. Okay, switching video over here. Yeah, we'll share it around. Sounds good. I'm going to spotlight it. Well, I think there's only one friend who's maybe still in the chat with us.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is one of our dear friends. If you want to add anything, just jump in. Sophie. And there's a note in the chat that I'll read. This project, the space and ethos all sound incredible. It hints at possibilities for an evolutionary leap that is so prescient, a collective community of collective collaboration and shared intention. So I just, this idea of like, could you have these 50 organizations, could they work together in such a way that there was a, I think, that there was that the organizations that were part of it, like BOARC, would be perceived as so important because of their relation to this network, or this ecology, that each would then be more kind of supported in their local contexts somehow. So, that the local universities, the local arts funding, the local research funding would all say, we're supporting BOARC, and we need to support it not in our own reference frame of like, do you meet our do you meet our outputs? Did you have the outputs for the research thing? Did you produce what, all the benchmarks that they use in their little parochial national context to measure you? Did you do that? But rather as an ambassador to a larger frame, where it's like, we support you because you have these relations with PAV and Massia and these other places around the world, and we don't really have to understand fully those relations because they're outside the national frame, because we acknowledge that they're outside this national situation. Like, is there a mode? I'm thinking about the modes of solidarity that could exist amongst these kind of hybrid labs, and like, I don't think it's something like there's a big pool of money and everybody donates and it's shared. That's possible, but it's very still kind of quantitative. So I'm imagining something more like it's the framework, it's the sociality, it's the ecology of these labs, which achieves some kind of level, and I don't know what it would take. It would take a lot, where it becomes where it has a certain degree of substance and recognition in its breadth, in its planetary positioning, where then the individual organizations that are part of it get a different kind of relation to. I'm thinking about also like how we get free from this, like that we need to get funding from these, we need to get funding from these local partners and from this nation. I mean, I think those things are true. We do need those fundings, but there needs to be something counterbalancing that. Our attention should be equally on this horizontal ecology, which is outside of nationality and, against a nation state framework, and which has this other ethos. That how do we get attention? I mean, I guess I'm asking, by putting attention on that, might we be able to build something that would be genuinely nourishing and sustainable and be a genuine kind of alternative to the situations in which we find ourselves forced to speak to these really very parochial demands?
You offered a really useful example of the library.
I did.
Yesterday when we were speaking this through. Maybe you could share that.
Yeah. Okay, so this journal, the Journal of Embodied Research, that I edit is published by Open Library of Humanities. You can look them up, openlibhums.org. And I was just talking about their funding model, because what happened to me, I was looking to start a journal, and I looked around. I had this idea for a journal, and I got a bunch of people who said they'd be on the editorial advisory board. And I started looking around, and I went to MIT Press, and I said, I had this great idea for a journal. Would you publish it? And they were kind of like, we like that idea of a journal. We like it. We do support open access. You have a good editorial board. We'd need about $30,000 a year. And I was like, what? You would need 30? And they were like, well, yeah, that's the running costs for the journal. So either you have a subscription base and everybody's paying for their individual access, or it's open access and we need $30,000 a year to run it. So I was just like, okay, obviously that's not the path to starting an open access journal. How, these kinds of questions that we have to ask. How should open access publishing be funded? And then I came across this initiative of Open Library of Humanities, which happened to also just be starting, and the timing was very good. And their model is a consortium of libraries. I think they're all university libraries. I don't think they include public libraries, although I'd have to check that. Maybe they do, or maybe they will. But a consortium of libraries, where now there's 300, 400 libraries, including, very top-ranked universities, etc., who all pay a membership fee to Open Library of Humanities. But the significant thing about it, I think, as a model, is that they don't technically get anything directly back for their membership fee, because all of the journals that they're publishing, that they're paying to support, are open access. So it's exactly the opposite of the private journal model that you have with Elsevier and those kinds of companies where, you force the university to pay because only by paying you get access to the journals. But Open Library of Humanities journals are by definition open access. They're available to anybody, so no library needs to pay to access them. So why do all of these libraries pay? And there are different tiers of subscriptions depending on the library and the investment. But like, why are all these people pay? How do they get 300 or 400 people to pay to become ongoing members? And it's not a one-time fee. I think it's an annual fee. So one of the points that they always make in selling it, and I'm not an expert in this, so I'm just kind of summarizing what I know, but they always point out like the amount of membership fee you're paying is tiny compared to what you're paying to the private companies. Because the private companies, as we all know, if we go on JSTOR and we try to get an article, it's like one article is like £36, right? That's one article. It's not a journal, it's an article. So for a journal for a year, you might pay, I don't know, £2,000, £5,000 or something. Whereas Open Library of Humanities, you're paying a much smaller amount because there's all of these libraries involved. So, somehow this argument has been made, and again, it's to librarians that it's being made, right? So it's not being made necessarily to the general public, it's being made to libraries. But the argument has been convincingly made that if we can create an ecosystem of open access publishing with a different economic model, that benefits everyone, and ultimately that will be better for everyone, even the people who are paying, than this private model where the private companies like Informa are trying to extract everybody's money. And what was it? Oh, and the last thing is like, because what then happens is that as Open Library of Humanities becomes more robust, and it gets this big consortium, then private journals start flipping. So you have private journals that have previously been private by subscription only because that's how they fund themselves, coming to Open Library of Humanities and being like, oh, could we become open access? Well, yes, we can publish you for free because we have this huge consortium. So you get the people leaving the private companies to come into this other ecosystem. And that's why I keep saying, like, academia, for all of its massive problems and in the way it's being completely demolished at the moment, academic publishing is still a different economics because you're not paid per item, per productivity. It's not universal, but it's a basic income model. It's like you get a salary and you do your work. Of course, that's less and less true, and it was always only true in a very limited way. But as a model, it is another model, right? There's an ethos there, which is like actually more like universal basic income and actually more like open access publishing and shared information. And so I think when we say para-academic, it's partly like we're like, yeah, those are some important models that we do want: open access publishing and support for research rather than per measurable output. So I think it's like, how can those models be brought into a much, much bigger para-academic world?
I just wonder about hot potato here. I just wonder about this consortium idea because I like it and it sounds healthier, but for me it's still somehow rooted in like the artist patron dyad, right? Like you're still in service of them in some way, right? Like they can still call the shots in a sense, right? They can decide to cut you off at some point, or members of the consortium can say, wow, that went in a really different direction. That was not the publication we were invested or interested in, and no thank you, you've lost X amount of money, which is fine because there will be someone else. There's still the pressure though to have this deliverable and to have this thing in a certain form that people expect. Again, I like it. I think it's healthy, but I definitely don't have the answer to how do we move out of the artist patron or the artist AHRC or, whatever funding body it is dynamic. But I do wonder about more shared resources or
the organizations themselves coming into, you know, contact, or is there a pot of shared funding? Is there a pot of, and that doesn't work in a lot of ways, but I'm curious, you know, what then, if it's not that, if it is closer to the consortium, what's the midpoint? Do you know what I mean? Because the shared pot doesn't work. The full-blown consortium can work, but it's that institutional tie that still somehow makes me skeptical, right? Because those ethics are not the shared ones. Like, for example, like the University of Huddersfield supporting the Open Library Access Journal, right? Like, that makes sense, right? In that dyad, in that dual relationship. But it's like, you know, I just don't know about the institutional backing of who is in the consortium would be my question, right? Like, who are the consortium members? Is it the local people like you were talking about yesterday, where, you know, you had mentioned this, right? Like, that people living in the area are the people who end up being the not like investors, but the people who are invested in the space and maybe perhaps offer resources, even if limited, or that it is some kind of locale. So yeah, I guess that would be my question, right? Is who ends up in the consortium? Who are the backers, right? In that way, or who are the make it possible-ers, or the helpers in that way? Is it do-goodery nonprofit types? Is it somebody else? Like, I don't know. So yeah, that's kind of what my big question would be.
Yeah, and in terms of labs, I mean, we're still talking about, like, with papers and things, like objects that are, and like thinking, so like in the background of this, I've been trying to think, like, some of the stuff that we've tried in the past, just thinking across like what would actually be useful for these kind of like lab networks, where it's like, right, actually, where does our money actually go? That's the other thing. Like, we're a very like lean operation, but like, where does that money go missing? Of course, it goes bills, it goes this, it goes that. But like these knowledge transfers that we actually need, like legality. Like, I remember like there was some time like where I spent a long time writing how we had like structured ourselves legally, like to put into this kind of like network, but it wasn't relevant to anybody else. Right. So that's one example. Another example, is using some of the models that we've tested here, which we're like, right, okay, again, this is something that can be shared. This is like also in terms of greening the building, things that we like, where money is being eked out in terms of profit, like that, not just for like this kind of leanness, but being like, right, there's a hack here somehow that would make sense across these networks. So yeah, these kind of like specificities when you're working with something that's non-object. So again, coming to the fact that the journal, these articles, they float, they're out of space, they're out of this kind of like specificity, enables that. So thinking in this other way of like, you're like, right, it needs to be the like locality, the councils, the thing that like are like, I recognize this just through its affiliation with this body, that there is a kind of certain quality here, or there's a certain value to what is happening here, and therefore we support. But yeah, like, yeah, these locality questions, these specificity questions, and this also comes to some of this other stuff, which would like, right, what is a lab network that's like rigorous in terms of how it exchanges its information, and like being like, right, how do we do this so this isn't kind of like one-to-one as well, in some of those kind of like questions, because the flow lines are completely different. So again, this open access library where something can land and then be moved in and out of is a different thing to the liveness, let's say, of like the lab network structure.
There's also something though about a critical mass, right?
Yeah.
Like your library idea, I mean, it functions because there are so many, right? And so actually it's about how you accumulate enough users, right? In order to like, I mean, this place will only function with users, and it functions for users. So it's like that has to build enough in order to sustain, which I guess PATH has arrived at that.
Yeah.
But yeah, how these different lab networks can help each other to get even to that point And then from that point, you can maybe imagine this sort of like, I'm actually finding Ben's proposal like really difficult to imagine, because like it's like how do you get there? Like how do you even step onto that in the first place? So it's like how you support each other to become sustainable is already the beginning of the network, right? But and outside of these other institutions and outside of like relying upon like external things, but then yeah, I mean it's hard to imagine within the current climate of like even at individual levels, sort of things are difficult, right? So but yeah, sort of I'm thinking about like snowball effect of like users, you know, like how you reach that point, which I think is a lot of the things that are happening here. Yeah, the library only works when there's loads of books, you know.
Yeah.
It's 6 minutes to 8. What is the, I have not been keeping time.
I kind of love that closing line of the
Yeah.
library only works if there's
Loads of books.
yeah. Actually kind of wonderful to my mind. I don't
Take us out.
Sure. Yes. So yes, thank you to all of our attendees. Sophie, did you want to add anything verbally, or Sophie is typing? So we'll stand by.
Hey, hi, thank
Hi,
you.
Sophie.
I'm just like multitasking and walking around in my pajamas, so I wasn't very
Oh.
visually present.
Thank you.
It was really interesting to listen to, and I've been wondering about the space for a long time, so it was nice to get an introduction to it, and also to learn about Masya. I didn't know about that. I knew about PAF, although I haven't been. Yeah, and I have it in mind as like I have the observatory in mind as a possible space for different kinds of inquiries coming up. Yeah, no, a lot resonating in terms of like the models of working together and how that can or cannot be sustained. Yeah.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Sophie. Great. Well, I think we're gonna call it a night here from the observatory. So good night to all of you, wherever you are.